between two psychologists. So Naomi Eilan is one of the grant winners for the Intellectual Humility Project. We were very happy to fund her extremely interesting project on the second personal. She's doing a very interesting conference of her own in the UK in March on the second personal. And she is professor of philosophy at Warwick. She's also president of the European Association for Philosophy and Psychology. She's published very widely in this area, numerous books and articles. She is advertising as a result of her work on this grant, a monograph called You, Me, and the World. I hope she finishes soon so I can read it. Can't wait. But for now, she is our next speaker, and she's going to give us a philosopher's perspective on all these complicated interdisciplinary issues. So, if you're ready, Naomi, with all the technology. You need a pocket, but the table will do. You can put it on the table for sure. Okay, so please welcome with me our next speaker, Naomi Eilan.
Bit of joint attention and to think again about Peter and Vasu's work, which I hadn't done for a while, and I find even more challenging and difficult now and fascinating than I did when I first started thinking about it. I also want to thank Eleanor and John for including us in the Intellectual Humility Project. By us, I mean my colleagues Johannes Ressler, Guy Longworth, and myself. Our mini project, our sub-project, is called The Dependent Species, Ourself and Others. And the link with intellectual humility is that it's a sort of second-order link, really. It's about what philosophers, and I think lots of psychologists still assume, that we can give an exhaustive account of self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-understanding, without bringing in others. So it's, for all I know, Descartes exercised, I don't know, but it could be the case that Descartes exercised lots of intellectual virtues in his day-to-day dealings with the intellectual world. But the second orderness of what I'm talking about is he still thought, and many still think, that when you give a philosophical account of what self-knowledge is, you can subtract the rest of the world and see and wholly explain what that consists in. Apropos intellectual humility, there's another kind which Peter mentioned, and I felt I resonated to it. Over the years, I've been privileged to work on and off in projects that involved psychologists as well on a variety of topics, spatial representation, self-awareness, and so forth. And it's extremely difficult to exercise humility relative to another discipline. It's unbelievably rewarding and also very, very difficult to actually listen, to hear what the problem is from their perspective, not to abandon your own to some middle ground of cognitive science or something, but to see how your individual sets of problems can illuminate each other. And that is hard, and I think it's also hard within philosophy and within psychology. So there's different areas of philosophy, philosophy of mind, which is the perspective I'm going to be talking from today, is kitted out, is sort of a separate entity relative to epistemology, metaphysics, often philosophy of religion. And I think something similar happens within psychologists. You can go to a cognitive psychology conference and there won't be a single developmentalist there, for example. And often in the meetings that we had in projects, some of the most interesting stuff is getting psychologists to talk to each other. And it is hard because there's so many hard and nitty-gritty questions that you have to do within your own specialized field, but actually sitting back and actually listening, and not just, as Peter said, taking a sexy example of autism and using it roughly as a thought experiment is difficult. So anyway, it's been rewarding to have to engage even in absentia of real-life local psychologists in that again. I've learned a huge amount from my co-speakers' works and also from Eleanor's reflections on the significance of that work to a whole range of issues. I'm not going to be discussing it directly, their work, but I hope that various points of contact will emerge and maybe in discussion this can come out. I see I've lost my paper. Here it is, I hope. Okay. So, to get going, imagine the following. You're sitting in a cafe, idly observing the passing show, and your attention is caught by someone scrambling in her bag, and you set about wondering what she's up to. Clearly, she's looking for something. Her phone, her keys, her purse. As these land on the table, and she persists in looking, you discard these hypotheses. The contents of her bag gradually cover up the table, and suddenly her shoulders relax with relief, and she retrieves a dice. Her search is over. You know what she was looking for. This example is an instance of what I will call third-person observational ways of acquiring knowledge and more generally engaging with other minds. Of course, there's an alternative way of finding out what she's up to and thinking, feeling. You can simply lean over and ask her. And if she's so inclined, she'll answer you, tell you. And she may even tell you why she was looking for a dice, which observation is unlikely to disclose. And this is an instance of what I'll call second-person communication way of finding out and engaging with other minds. Others meant of going on. Mind isn't meant to be an abstraction, and as a philosopher might talk about mind, I mean goings on in people's minds. Now, if one's general interest is in different ways we have of connecting with minds of other people, as mine will be throughout, the immediate question for the way I've divided the cases up is what justifies it? Why think this particular division is interesting and significant? And how exactly are the third and second person defined here so as to make it a significant way of dividing up the field? This is the question I'll be taking on explicitly only in the second half of the paper, though I'll be leading up to it as we go along. To introduce the issues that will concern us before we get there, I want to have before us two further examples, which introduce a distinction under the second-person communication heading between two types of case. In the first, you're having a conversation with someone and she looks over your shoulder and says, "I see a full moon." Call this the verbal communication case. In the second scenario, you're both looking at the moon together. And the fact that you are is, as people say, mutually manifest. Because of this, there's no need to exchange words for you to know that she sees the moon. All is out in the open, and not a word has passed between you. This is a typical case of joint attention, and I'll duly label it the joint attention case. And the first half of the paper will be concerned with the peculiar kind of transparency of one mind to another that distinguishes the joint attention case from most verbal communication cases. I'll then come back to what the two have in common and what distinguishes both of those from the third person observational case. Now, I'm going to begin with a minimally committal textbook introduction to the developmental trajectory that leads up to joint attention. Vasu Reddy has fascinatingly more nuanced descriptions of these in these two papers, but I don't think that the kinds of things I want to say turn on this way of putting the trajectory. They may, and I'd be interested. So here's the story that you usually hear. Up until the age of about 9 months or 10 months, infants engage in two kinds of dyadic relation. One such relation is with their caregivers, the other with physical objects of various kinds. From about the age of 9 or 10 months, we find the onset of various forms of behavior that underpin episodes of joint attending and much else, or attending together to an object. The behaviors, on most accounts, entrenched in their basic shape by about 12 months, include producing pointings aimed at directing the adult's attention, responding to such pointings, checking the adult is attending to the right object, for example, by looking into her eyes and checking the direction of gaze, and various expressions of delight and pleasure, both before and I think especially after the adult's attention to the object has been secured. So in all these accounts, during episodes of jointly attending or joint attention, a three-way triadic relation is established between two subjects and an object, in contrast to the earlier dyadic ones. But once we ask how this relation should be distinguished from cases in which we have mere alternation between two kinds of dyadic relation, all hell breaks loose. There's hardly a major debate in developmental psychology and more recently in the philosophy of mind that doesn't find expression in the minefield that's created by raising this question. I found it useful in trying to get a grip on the basic shape of the field to go back to the way the developmentalist Jerome Bruner introduced the very idea of joint attention as a subject for research in the 1970s. There's a simplicity about it, which captures beautifully, I think, both why the phenomenon is so important and also why so very many questions need to be juggled in trying to get it right. I'll isolate a few claims he makes, and then, with these in place, turn to the issues I want to consider. Now, and this comes back to a question that John raised for Peter, Bruner's background concern at the time was the question of how children acquire language. His claim was that joint attention is essential for learning what the words of a common language refer to, what they mean. This was sometimes articulated in the book Child's Talk relative to Chomsky's claims. The slogan was, "Every lad needs a lass." That is, every Chomskyan innate language acquisition device needs supplementation with a social learning language support system. Very crudely, lad makes possible the acquisition of surface syntax on this story, and lass is required for semantics, in particular reference. Joint attention, as he conceived of it, was the product of lass and the basis for learning reference. The link with the learning of reference has, my impression, to a large extent dropped out of much current work on joint attention, and I'll say in passing that I think it's a shame. I think it imposes an interesting and important constraint. but I'll leave it there. Rather, I want to take off from the way Brunner himself later expanded the claim when he became interested in what he called the problem of other minds. On that version, the slogan became, and was also the title of a paper of his, "Joint attention makes the meeting of minds possible." Now, the fundamental claims he made, I'll give them first in the form he made them and then come to the starred version of himself that's on the handout. The claims he made were these. I'm summing up a book here. First, the social structure into which joint attention is slotted when it develops is essentially communicative. Joint attention, when it emerges in children, is, in some sense, the product of a pre-linguistic communication system which exists between infants and their caregivers. The second claim was that in order for joint attention to perform its reference securing and or mind-meeting role, and it's interesting that the two come together, again I'm noting this without elaborating, according to Brunner, we need to endorse what he called 3 bold claims, which are as follows. We have to take infants to be primitively disposed towards what he calls naive realism. Second, we must take them to be primitively disposed towards treating others they interact with as experiencing the same world they do. And finally, for the latter to be possible, infants must be disposed to share their experiences with others, thereby manifesting a treatment of others as having minds like their own. Okay? Now, Brunner himself locates his claims in the nativism versus empiricism debate. However, I think they survive a bracketing of that debate, interesting as it is in its own terms, and a reformulation into claims about the framework that we, as theorists of the situation, should adopt when explaining joint attention, claims that might be made both for children and for adults, okay, whenever they achieve joint attention. Thus translated, I'll read them as saying the following, and this is on the handout. So the first claim on that is this. This is a translation minus the empiricism versus nativism debate, the communication claim. It should read, yes, joint attention is an essentially communicative phenomenon. The naive realism claim. As theorists of joint attention, we should be naive realists about perceptual experience and assume naive realism when we explain how joint attention is achieved. Third, the sharing claim. And I've collapsed various bits into this, into a bit of a mouthful. Explaining joint attention requires explaining what it is for experiences to be shared in a way that makes manifest how the problems of other minds is thereby dissolved. I've got a quote there from Philippe Rochard, which captures something important that I'm not going to be talking to, but I think also picks up on ideas informing both Vasu's and Peter's work. That behind all of this, we've got to remember something important, which he describes as an irresistible drive the children are born with to maintain social closeness and to control social intimacy. So there's a very important notion here that I won't be talking about, the notion of closeness and intimacy that we need to remember, and of course is quite important in the use that Eilan makes of some of the joint attention literature. I'm putting that in brackets as a background, sort of why we care about it, but I won't be talking about it here. I'm going to take off, given the claims I've got, with his 3 claims, I'm going to take off from the following observation. I think that whatever your view about the three claims, it's got to be conceded that he captures brilliantly why it's so difficult and why it's so fundamental, the phenomenon of joint attention. This number and depth of issues we need to negotiate when trying to explain them as sort of the big issues. I think it also explains partially why current literature and joint attention I find, and I think lots of people find, very disparate, because there's so many issues that you might be focusing on that people take off on particular ones. My own view is also, and it's implicit in what he shares, but here is something that I think is, what makes it difficult is that I think getting it right requires adopting quite radical views. I don't think they're particularly radical relative to the way we ordinarily think of ourselves, but they are radical relative to pretty entrenched philosophical assumptions, and I find mirrors of them in psychology as well. And I'll try and say something about them as we go along. I'm going to use as the framing claim for what I'm going to say the sharing claim, and pick up on the other issues as they fall into developing sharing. Now, the concept is used increasingly in the literature on joint attention, in the literature on joint action, and it's used in disparate ways, some of them very bottom-up ways, some of them more reflective, some experiential. I'm going to make do with just the following simple constraint on my development of the notion of sharing, which is one that Bruner himself endorsed, is that whatever you say about it, it's got to deliver mutual manifestness or mutual openness. So what I'm adopting in the case of joint attention is the so-called rich interpretation of it. That's how the rich interpretation is defined, as opposed to a kind of sharing that requires just various coordinations that can be explained by the subpersonal mechanisms. Those are the preliminaries. Now, I want to have before us, and I think it's now on the handout, thanks to Josh, an example. I think people prefer to master examples. Because what I'm going to say at times will be a bit abstract, and it's nice to have an example in mind. So this is the example in the handout. I'll read it out. Consider the following case. You're sitting at a pep talk organized by senior university administrators, in which, this is a bit autobiographical, the idea of a Warwick entrepreneurial gene, say, or they call some equivalent piece of bullshit in Frankfurt's technical sense of the term, is being promoted. At some point, you raise your head from your doodling, and your eyes lock into those of a colleague sitting opposite you at a large table. This meeting of eyes may last just a split second, and then you each return to whatever it is you were doing before. Here are two of various possible scenarios that I want us to bear in mind. The first is this. All that happens is a brief, almost deadpan meeting of eyes that suffices to establish you both feel and think exactly the same about the proceedings. The second scenario, your eyes meet, you expect an exchange of shared embarrassment, despair, and so forth. Instead, you encounter eyes shining with enthusiastic endorsement. This kind of exchange takes a bit longer, probably, as you each adjust to registering the difference, before you return to your doodles and he resumes his rapt attention to the speaker. Now, the initial feature I want to highlight about this example is this. Unlike in many illustrations of the phenomenon of joint attention, your perceptual experience of the object is in one modality, hearing, and your interpersonal exchange is in another, vision. Now, I think the possibility of distributing modalities in joint attention is very important for a whole bunch of reasons. I'll say a little bit about it when I describe some work done on blind and deaf children. But for current purposes, its interest or its use is, in this particular example, is that it makes vivid a fundamental distinction between two kinds of things that might be shared, two respects in which sharing may or may not occur during an episode of joint attention. First, there's a clear sense in which minds meet in the first scenario, the quick flash of mutual understanding, and don't in the second. Crudely, your respective responses, your evaluations, emotional take, and so forth are shared in the first case and aren't in the second. Second, however, there's something that is shared in both cases, namely the perceptual experience. Even when you're startled or bemused by your colleagues' enthusiasm for the idea of a Warwick gene, there's no question as to what you're both hearing. On some level of description, you have a perceptual experience in common. On some level, you can argue about where we should pitch that exactly. Now, in everyday language, when we speak of sharing our experiences of an event, a thing, we often mean both the experience and the response. And I think in the developmental literature, we find emphasis sometimes on one, sometimes on another. But these do need distinguishing. And each, I think, needs to be dealt with separately. Though this might be a point of connection or disagreement with Peter, but I think this is my view anyway, that's the position I'm taking. I'll label the first the shared perceptual experience, and the second the shared response ingredient. Joint attention, as I'll strictly understand it, refers to the shared experience component. So it's what we have in common as we register in a flash what we are experiencing. Okay. I'll only come back to the shared response ingredient towards the end of the paper, I hope, if I have time, not because I think it's less important. In fact, I think the whole point of joint attention is to share responses to objects, but just because I found as I was writing the paper that getting the experiential ingredient took longer and was more difficult than I had anticipated. But I hope I can come back to the shared response ingredient and its relation, say more a bit about why I'm distinguishing them as I am. Okay, as the object attended to in the university example case is somewhat complex, it'll help, now I'm talking about the shared experience component, to have a simpler example before us. Suppose then that you're standing outside your house chatting to a neighbor and you both catch sight of an incredibly beautiful low harvest moon, and you stand looking at it together, perhaps commenting on it, but that's not important for this particular example. Our questions now, or the questions I want to consider, are first, and this is I'm constantly referring back to Bruner's framework, okay, so that's the thing that's holding all of this together. How should we describe each of your experiences before joint attention sets in? And how should we describe them afterwards? Before joint attention, and here I'm addressing the naive realism claim. In current philosophical debates about perception, the naive realism claim is usually aired in the context of the question, how should we explain what your experience is like? What the phenomenal character of your experience is? Say when you see a red cube in front of you. On the one hand, we find those who appeal to sensational properties or to representational properties, how the world is represented, or to a combination of these. On the other hand, we have the naive realists, who often in current debates on the topic adopt what's called a relational approach to perception. On the latter view, or the version I want to have before us, to have a perceptual experience of an object is to stand in a non-representational, non-propositional relation of acquaintance to the object, where the properties of the object, its shape, its color, are presented to you directly in virtue of standing in this relation. So in getting right your experience, I have to refer to those properties of the object, okay? Not to any mediated representation or sensation and so forth. That's the naive realist, right? So there's a kind, apropos Cartesian theories of mind, there's a kind of very strong anti-Cartesianism here about perception. The world out there imprints itself on the phenomenal layout of what it's like for me. So to adopt a relational view is to hold that perceiving an object is a dyadic relation first and foremost. Okay? Prior to and independent of any seeing that. And the knowledge of the object is relational as opposed to a version of a knowing that. I think this is a highly plausible developmental claim to make if we're interested in the child's developing understanding of the concept of perception, say, and any understanding she may or may not bring to bear on what's happening in joint attention. But the claim here is, and the one I went up before, is that this notion also has priority for theorists of children or adults when they're explaining perception. It's a relational notion. The world's out there is in my mind. Okay, as anyone working on perception will know, this is a highly contestable claim, and one of the many contestable claims you have to deal with if you adopt Bruner's framework, and I'm here mentioning it, noting it, and I'm not going to try and defend it, because my question now is, suppose we accept that. What do we say now? So this is true of each me and my neighbor's experience of the moon. What do I say about the experience when joint attention sets in? How does this inform our conception of the kind of sharing that happens when joint attention sets in? Now, as I say it, I think there's basically two kinds of move that people make here. You can either appeal, as people do, to some form of iterated reflective awareness you each have of each other's perception of the moon and the awareness of the other's awareness, the awareness of the moon, and so forth. Or you can say that your first order experience of the world is transformed, and that what is owed is a new account of an experience, without appeal to any second order stuff. Now, the latter is the option chosen by John Campbell, building on and extending his relation approach to the perception of objects. And he sets his experiential account as against the iterated account that Christopher Peacock proposes of what's happening once joint attention sets in. Again, the question of whether appeal to iterations can achieve the desired openness and whether it can be right phenomenologically or developmentally, given that joint attention is such a really basic phenomenon, is another one of the big questions that the phenomenon of joint attention gives rise to. And again, I make do with noting it rather than engaging with it and arguing with it. So I want to look at what happens if we take the basic. The Peacock stuff is incidentally on the handout. If we try and take seriously the experiential first order story. Okay, so this is the claim that once joint attention sets in, the sharing is to be explained not by appeal to a kind of reflective and iterated awareness we have of each other's experiences, but by some kind of account of the experience we now both have or have together. Now, Campbell's own relational view is simply stated, and it's on the handout. He said, we should take joint attention to be a personal level, non-propositional state. We should think of it as a three-place relation between subject, co-attender, and object. The relation is primitive. X and Y are jointly attending to Z. Okay. So there's an attempt here to extend his relational treatment of the perception of objects to an explanation or a description of what happens when it's you, me, and the object. Now, just one comment before I go and raise issues and questions for this, because I think it's probably the best starting point around, and certainly to be preferred to the iterated story. To take this idea seriously is to say that the experience, to so much as begin engaging with it and finding how you move around in it, is to say that the experience you have in jointly attending to an object with someone depend for their very experiential nature on someone else. This is an experiential dependence, not a causal one, though it obviously has subpersonal causal underpinnings. The idea is it's internal, constitutive of how things are for you. And you have this experience that there's someone there. Now, that's the claim. What does it amount to and what justifies it? This depends on how we address the question, how exactly does the other enter, or in virtue of what, into your perceptual experience? And how do we describe the relation between you and the other when she is being conceived of as a constituent of your experience? It strikes me that the appeal to the form of acquaintance that is applied to explain awareness of objects can't work as it stands. While you may be perceptually aware of your co-attender's physical properties, she's not there for you as a perceived object. So if the relation is experiential, it's not the same kind of experiential relation you have to objects in the environment. Now, this is recognized very briefly by Campbell in a very succinct one-sentence claim. He says, joint attention is a relation of experience between X, Y, and Z. When this holds, X has Z as the object of attention, and Y is there as co-attender. There is that difference between the way in which X is related to Z and the way in which X is related to Y. End of sentence and end of discussion of the issue. And this is the issue I want to pursue. And he may have had several ways of developing this difference, but they are not revealed. And what I want to do now is make some gestures at saying something about this difference, supposing I want the other to be present in my experience. And I should say that this is the claims that are on the handout and the claims I'm going to elaborate, they're more like names of problems than names of solutions. So I'll say as much as I can about where I see the issues are and highlight where one of the most difficult things I find in developing them. Okay. So the claims which are on your handout are these. So the question is, how am I related to the other when the other is to use Campbell's phrase, a constituent of my experience? So the second person claim says that the relation between co-attenders is a second person relation. When we attain jointly as subjects, we are aware of each other as you. Relationality. The justification for a relational reading of the interpersonal component in joint attention rests, I'd suggest, with the justification of a relational reading of what holds between us when we have a second person perspective on each other. And the final claim, and this connects up with things that people, in fact, it's the same phrase that Peter used, the communicative stance claim is that to adopt the slightly different purpose, to adopt a second person perspective, to be aware of someone as you, is in its most basic and minimal form to adopt a communicative stance towards the other. Minimal second person awareness of a person and adoption of a communicative stance towards that person and evil. And this is one point where I think there might be differences in the account that Eleanor gives. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, so one way of bringing out the general point of these claims is to return to Bruner's basic framework. So far, I've focused mainly on naive realism about experiences and a particular account of how we should describe the outcome of sharing, assuming the naive realist framework. I've said nothing about what's required of the participant subjects for sharing to occur in the first place, nor about how and whether and how such requirements enter into the characterization of the shared experience. I've also not said anything about the idea that joint attention, when it occurs in early childhood, is essentially the product of an early communication system, and how, if that's true, that enters into the account of joint attention itself. And finally, I've said nothing about how exactly appeal to joint attention is meant to engage with the other mind's problem. Now, the three claims are intended to draw all of that together, and what I want to do is just give a sketch of how they hang together and how they address those questions in combination with each other. Now, by way of connecting the first half of the paper, or more time, with the second, I want to do my best to describe work which I was hoping to do my bit on the video front, to have a video to describe to you, but it's still not. The person who did the work, Maria Nunez, you pronounce her, on joint attention in blind and deaf children, doesn't have permission to release it. I saw the video at the last meeting of the European Society for Philosophy of Psychology, and I was extremely struck by it, and she's kindly gone through with me a verbal description of what happens there, because I think what you get there is all the ingredients, my own view, is that you need to highlight in joint attention, but in slow motion. And some of it brings out the direct realism, but some of it moves us into the communication claims. So let me, as Peter's video showed, words really can't do the work of a video, but I'll try nonetheless. So this is a clip of a child who's nearing on 3, somewhere between 2.5 and 3. The setup is this. The mother and child are seated at sort of this kind of angle at each other. The child is facing the mother. The mother they're both on the floor, has her hands on the floor, sort of facing the child. A big box of toys is introduced between the two of them. The mother, at some point, when the box is introduced, the child starts checking the mother's arms, listening to her chest. She taps her chest to listen for vibrations of speech, and listens to her, puts her hand at the mouth to catch the breath. Now this is actually before the toys. As Maria describes it, she's checking the orientation or the preparedness for engagement of the mother. The box is introduced. The mother quickly lifts something that's in the box and lets the child hold it and immediately returns her arm. Partly, Maria says, for reasons of balance. Okay. The child has touched it. She now picks it up, quickly takes the mother's hand, just lets her touch it, and puts the hand back. Begins again another bout of checking the engagement, but also laughing. And it sounds like, and as Maria describes it, she's now checking for the response, the joint response. So this is the sequence of, and I think this is roughly as Maria described it, checking for orientation. This is what I'm calling for, in my terms, engagement or adoption of a communicative stance. Quickly checking that the object's the same. Rechecking the communicative stance and then sharing in the pleasure. And very touchingly, the face is directed up at the mother. Of course, one of the points there, apropos what Peter said, was that this is somebody who's had extraordinary attention from the mother, and very sensitive attention, as distinct from what happens if you get blind, bumped into a school very early on. I'll just say, headline it without pursuing it, I think this makes an excellent case for naive realism. If you're trying to say what it is that they're both experiencing in common, it's the object. If you try and explain this with anything by appeal to sensations, there's nothing in common, really. There might be, but it doesn't seem to be essential. But the main thing, and when you try to sort of configure what's happening in the sharing, there really is. There's the two engaged subjects and that object they're engaging with. Very compelling just to describe the situation by appeal to the relation between the three. What I'm moving on now is to talk about what I've called, and I think Maria calls it something similar, and this is the term that Peter used, this preparedness for engagement. Okay. And it does happen, and it's separable temporally from the reaction to it in this case. Okay. So it could well be that there's emotional engagement in the establishment of the communicative relation. But I think that needs separate treatment from whatever we want to say about the sharing of response once this has been established. So the question is, how should we describe that? And as I see it, what we're describing is what happens in a flash at that university meeting. 2 seconds flat, you've established that you're engaging with the same hearing. Then you might either respond the same or not. Okay, so this is a slowed down version of that. How do we describe it? How are we doing for time, actually? Okay. We'll see how, I think what I'll do is simply take it as far as I can in the time that I have, and whatever doesn't get said either can come up in discussion or not. Okay. Sharing, if you remember, is meant to dissolve the other mind's problem. Okay, so a brief excursion into the latter. Philosophers traditionally divide it into the epistemological and the conceptual version, and I'm going to focus on the latter. And that comes in 2 parts as well. The first asks, how can we make sense of the idea that the same concept, say the concept of pain, that I apply in my own case, applies to someone else, when the grounds for application are so distinct, say, feeling and observing. And that's often labeled the unity question. How do we explain the unity of our mental concepts? The other problem, which is sometimes labeled the fig problem, is this. How do we make sense of the very idea of there being other subjects out there, other centers of consciousness, other eyes? Okay. When there's such a disparateness in the way we are aware of ourselves as self-conscious subjects and the way we are aware of others. What I want to do now immediately is focus on the so-called thick problem. And if there's time, I'll come back to the unity question, which I think links up very much to the response component, the production and response to expressions of feeling. So that would be a key concept. But I'm going to start first just with a big problem. Okay, why is there a problem here? What's meant to be difficult? What's so difficult by making sense of other, or relative to what is it difficult to make sense of the existence of other centers of consciousness? One route into formulating the problem turns on the following line of reasoning. Only I can think of myself in a first-person way, the way expressed using I. That way of thinking, that is not reducible to or translatable into a description which is such that anyone else would grasp it and use it to think of myself. Okay. Something irreducibly non-descriptive about I, because if it were descriptive, anyone would think it. If there are other subjects out there, the same will be true of them. So for all of us, it's true that we can only think about each other in some other way than using the first person. And this other way is usually labeled a third-person way, which might be expressed by that person, or he or she, or some description. So for each of us, it's true that the other person's first-person thinking, or more generally their first-person perspective, necessarily eludes our grasp. Of course, you can pretend to grasp the other first-person perspective from the inside by imagining what one do oneself if it were one were in that situation. The situation described from the third-person perspective. But when you do that, all you're doing is spreading your first-person perspective on others. Others become possessors of a first-person perspective for you by you spreading your own perspective. It's me all the way down. Now, normal subjects aren't thus afflicted, so something's wrong with the way we've set up the problem. And there's been increasing interest in recent years in the idea that if we get right and appeal to the second-person perspective, we'll capture what's wrong with this way of describing our predicament. Okay. So it's sometimes said the second person will bridge the gap between the first person perspective and the third by somehow showing how others' first person's perspectives can be present to us as first person perspectives but distinct from ours. So it's something I get not just by spreading myself on the world. Now, it's a tall order to deliver confrontation with a first-person perspective that's a genuinely first-person perspective, but distinguished from mine. And so it's not surprising when people appeal to the second person in order to solve this particular problem. A whole bunch of different interesting things can be said here. And I'm going to say just a small sliver that will connect us back to the joint attention claim issue and to the communicative stance claim. So here's first a stipulation. Suppose you and I are having a conversation about anything, the book, a philosophical problem, the state of the world, and so forth. In virtue of having such a conversation, we are each in a position to use the second-person pronoun to address each other. Conversations aren't the only kind of exchange that makes the use of the second-person pronoun possible and appropriate, simply in virtue of engaging in the exchange. Any form of verbal communication will do it, but so do sharing a smile, exchanging gifts, playing a game with someone, and so forth, as too does joint attending to an object. In virtue of jointly attending with someone, the use of the second person is appropriate. Have I run over time? Oh, right. Okay. So I'm going to call relations that we stand to each other in virtue of which use of the second person is appropriate, second person relations, and the perspective we adopt on each other when we're standing in the kind of relation that makes the use of the second person pronoun appropriate, a second person. Okay, that's the stipulation. Does it capture anything interesting psychologically? Okay. Is the possibility of addressing someone using the second person and standing in this kind of relation to someone internal to the characterization of a certain kind of psychological state I'm in? Okay. Or a psychological way of engaging with someone? Or is it merely an external marker? Okay, the possibility of using the second person, which may be underwritten by a whole bunch of disparate, perhaps related in some way, psychological, mental components. Now, I think the prevailing view in people who aren't enthused, as some of us are, by the potential, the explanatory potential for the second person, the consensus, at least in analytic philosophy of mind, has been that it is merely a superficial marker. Okay? This was expressed by Richard Head in the claim, there's no such thing as a second person belief. Okay? And if people are interested, we can come back to the exact formulation and reason for this. But the claim I'm making when I make the second person claim is that it's not just an external marker. Okay? There's as it were, genuine psychological kind here. And the kind is marked by this readiness for communication, because it's part of Heck's story that communication is external to my internal goings on. Okay, so that's the point relative to the literature, getting the communicative stance in. Okay, so the claim is it's a sui generis, irreducible psychological kind of relation we can have with each other. Now, that's the claim. How can it help with the thick problem, making others' first-person perspective present to us, but thought of as distinct from one's own? Okay. I'm going to sketch a story about thought and how it might work for the case of thought, and then raise some issues relative to that, to how we can extend it to cases when we are, to experiential cases, like the case of jointly attending to something. Okay, so I'll first give you a model of something that's been said about thought, a claim about sharing, that, as I read it, delivers a present first-person perspective. And then I'll raise questions about how it can be extended to sharing experiences. And I think I'll probably leave issues there and not have time to come back to the shared responses. Okay, so here's the claim that's been made. Guy Longworth made it, but it was independently made by Sebastian Roeder and several people thinking in disparate directions about the nature of second-person thought. So, suppose A says to B, you are trading sugar on the supermarket floor. It's generally accepted that understanding what is being said requires that B think I am trading sugar on the supermarket floor. Okay. So the uptake of a thought expressed by you requires using the first person, expressing a first person thought. Okay. That's a claim about understanding what's expressed. But suppose we now think about the kind of thinking that I express when I say to you, you're trading sugar. The idea here is that the thought I express is shared between you and me. It's an I-you thought, which is such that in grasping it, I have to think you. I have to grasp it, addressing you as you, and you, in grasping it, have to think an I thought. Okay? So it's a kind of thinking for two. The grasping it requires different but complementary things from the two of us. If it's hard to get your mind around that, let me just give you one analogy where you may be more familiar with it. It's a claim that's been made about temporal thinking as well. Okay? Suppose I thought yesterday, it's raining now. Okay, using now. Can I retain the same thought today? The idea is yes, I can retain the same thought by thinking the thought I've expressed with it was raining then. Okay. Same thought, different indexicals required for grasping it. That's an internal temporal case. The idea is that you have exactly the same in the interpersonal case with I-you. I'm thinking of you in the you way. For you to pick it up, you have to think in an I way, and we are this now. So this is a serious sense of sharing a thought. Okay. Now, if you accept it, there's two things that are happening here. First is that you're accepting that in characterizing let's go, it's confusing using I and you in the example. So let's go back to A and B. A thinks of B, you are trailing sugar, thereby sharing the thought that B expresses by thinking, I am trailing sugar. Okay. If you accept this, you're saying that there's no characterizing what's going on in A's mind when she thinks that thought, except by reference to I's self-conscious thinking. Okay. Subtract that, and you haven't got that episode of thinking. Okay. So this is one sense of both deep relationality combined with a particular sense in which another person's perspective is present to you. And it's quite radical. But what it's assuming, and this is what's hard, is that there isn't, this is the basic story. There isn't a story where I can say, okay, but what's really going on in A's head? Surely I must be able to give some account of it that doesn't depend on I's thinking. And indeed, Peacock here too gives an account in terms of iterations that use only the first and third person. Okay. So that's the claim about thought. That other person's perspective is present to me because I can't complete my thinking, and there isn't any other description of my thinking except by bringing in the other person's perspective, first person perspective. How, if at all, could this be used? Now that's the model. I think there's something deep and interesting there. And I think we should be able to find a way of explaining the kind of sharing that happens in joint attention by using that model. What I'm stuck on, and I'll finish with this rather than move on to things I'm less stuck on, is the following. And it may be easy to bring it out, actually, by returning to Campbell's claim that this experience is primitive. Okay. Now, he means several things by primitive. One thing he means is that it's relational rather than involving a representation and a seeing that. Another thing he means is that it doesn't involve reflection and iteration. But he also means a third thing. Here, let's take just the case of acquaintance with objects, is that I can give an account of the relation of acquaintance to an object without presupposing and without needing to refer to the kind of thought it enables. Okay? So it's more basic than and explains the capacity for thinking demonstratively about an object. Now, I should say straight out that I think he's right when we turn to joint attention in all senses, or I would be happy to endorse and argue for all senses of primitiveness when it applies to the relation we each have to the object. What I'm less clear about is whether the lost sense of primitiveness, i.e. the capacity to give an exhaustive characterization of it without appeal to the capacities it sustains, whether that holds when we're trying to describe the IU engagement that happens in that split moment when we share experiences prior to commenting, or when the little girl and her mother are engaged with each other. And I'll say what my hesitation is, and I think I had a brief chat with Peter about it. It connects very much also to issues about the relation here between philosophy and developmental psychology. Here's one claim I might make, and I don't think it can be right. I can say, look, the only characterization I can give of the IU relation and joint attention will need to appeal to the possibility of sharing thoughts of the kind I've described, okay? Expressing and sharing thoughts with this structure. There isn't any characterization of the IU relation which is more primitive than that. To get IU, I need to have that story in. I need to have built in the capacity to communicate those thoughts into the description of what that ability is, okay? Even when it's not exercised. The alternative would be to say, look, there's a kind of primitive experiential relation that we can appeal to that explains how such IU thoughts get going, analogous to the way my perception of an object explains what makes it possible for me. My own inclination at the moment is to say that there really is this difference between how we characterize our relation to objects and perception and how we get at, as it were, the essence of the IU relation. Which is to say, we do need, I suppose we're interested in the way the second person makes other person's perspectives, that we do need to describe it by appeal to the possibility of expression, expressing it in this way. But this is where one of the interesting and hard questions in developmental psychology comes in, I think. First, a word about philosophy of mind. There's sort of familiar claim that people make in the philosophy of mind, look, so long as I have the background capacities, I don't need to actually exercise them, but it's still correct to apply them in describing what I'm up to, say, in perception. I think, so that might be one claim I could make is, look, I don't have to exercise the capacity of thinking I see the moon so that you pick it up in that way. It's correct to characterize the IU relation, even though I'm not exercising. But I think Peter raised, and Vasu's work raises another issue, whether you even have to have those capacities for it to be correct to say, this is the best description I can give you of the situation. It may be that there isn't a better description of the exchange between the little girl and her mother, or even then, this is what's going on. It's the kind of thing that would be expressed in this way. If you want me to break it down, I can break it down into various components. But to borrow a phrase of Peter's, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and the whole can only be captured in terms of this capacity, which may not yet be possessed. And I think that's just an issue in developmental psychology, how much you import the descriptions of what it becomes into the description of what it is beforehand. and how much what it is beforehand informs, that's the big tension, how we describe what happens later. I think this is, and the issue of joint attention and the IU thoughts, I think, I mean, I have to go on about it, there's details of it, why this tension in developmental psychology itself is so fruitful for thinking about this basic IU relation in joint attention. But coming back to the experiential story, I think it's got to be the right one. And I think there's got to be some way, when we're describing the experience of joint attention, of availing ourselves of the idea of a shared IU thought. So either you say there's an IU experience that's built into it, or you say, and give an account of, and I'm not sure how an account of that would go, or you describe the experience by appeal to the possibility of the thought it sustains. But that's the direction I think we should be taking. And I think both to Peter and to Vassilis, all of this will have sounded like Hamlet without the prince, because I haven't mentioned any emotions yet. They would have come into the talk that the way shared responses and shared expressions and responses to it are needed for, as it were, addressing the unity question. But I think that's it. Thank you. Okay.
So we have time for questions. Anybody wants to begin, Bas?
Okay, I'll just thank you. That was wonderful. When I studied this, I said,
Yeah.
many bits, but one in particular that last bit.
Yeah.
About why John Campbell's impacts of might work for you in terms of John that might not quite explain the shared prioritization of thought. Right?
Well, it's almost, so suppose you think you have a triadic relation in play, and let's label it experiential and primitive, at least in the sense that you don't think it requires iterative reflections. And you do want to adopt a sense of primitiveness where it's a direct relation to a person and to an object, okay? And the issue is, how do you describe this direct relation, assuming that the simple acquaintance model for physical objects and the way they implant yourself. Okay, so the problem is to get to the other person's perspective into my mind, okay? Yeah. And so the question for me was, and I'm inclined in a certain way that I'm very open to see it going in other ways, that getting the IU bit there can't be described independently of the capacity it sustains for thought that is expressed using the first person perspective. And this differs. So there's a sense in which, I mean, why I don't like that way of saying it and why it's problematic, because the way I was going to finish the sentence was, and so there's a sense in which this kind of experiential relation isn't explanatory of the capacity to think thoughts in the same way that acquaintance with objects is explanatory of the most. And as soon as you say that, that doesn't sound quite right. So, so indeed, and this is one of the bits where the missing prince might come in, but I'm not sure exactly how. You might say something like this, and I think it can. Okay, I'll say what I think you might say and why I don't think you should say it generalized. You might think, look, there's a kind of IU experience, emotional engagement, and I can give an exhaustive account of it, which will deliver what it is for a first-person perspective to be present to me as distinct, without appealing to the possibility of expressing those emotions in terms of shared thoughts. Okay, so that would be the claim. And I'm actually sort of, I don't know of a description of emotions and so forth. So there's a sense of explanatoriness and primitiveness, which I think is absolutely right. You might say the first manifestation or a basic manifestation of the structure is in the exchange of emotions. So don't look for the manifestation of it in thought rather than emotion. But the issue of whether we can catch that without appealing to the idea of the possibility of shared thought is the one which I personally wouldn't find bothersome, and I don't think developmentalists need find it bothersome under some description. But I don't know, I mean, and this is a really hard issue. And so there's a sense, if you do think that the first manifestation of it is in a kind of exchange in emotions, you might well be happy to accept a kind of explanatory claim. Developmentally, the capacity to engage in these emotions grounds the subsequent capacity to express it in thought. But that's consistent with the claim that there's no description of even the emotional capacity that doesn't appeal to to the potential of expressing it in thought. Yeah. But it's not very attractive. I mean, somebody can tell me a story which shows why this is the shared thought thing is just an analogy, and maybe this will work. And I can find the exact same structure independently of the possibility of expressing what's going on by use of I and you. Okay? And sharing a content. I'd be really delighted to hear it. And I'm sure there's actually a few questions here that I'm probably muddling together that could be distinguished. Yeah, sorry.